Hey, Derek here for Civic Punks. Continuing my journal of my time with the Creative Bureaucracy Festival. The more attentive of you will notice that I am, in fact, back in my home office and out of Berlin. Yes, I got very much immersed in my experience with the Creative Bureaucracy Festival and forgot to take as many on-site videos as I wanted. So, apologies, but I'm hoping to capture some of the ideas retroactively, which I think are really interesting. This video, I want to focus on one of the highlights of the trip for me, which is the Innovators Forum. This is an unconference that happens the day before the festival. So, for those of you unfamiliar with an unconference, you'll know that it's one of my favorite facilitation forums. Basically, there is no agenda. At the beginning, people can suggest topics they want to talk about. It's voted on, and then the topics get put into different segments, into what's called a grid. And then you can basically go and join the discussion that you want to engage with it. And it's a really good way of surfacing what are the hottest topics for people in the room at that time. So what were the burning issues for the people who were in the room? Well, I'm going to quickly go through and give high-level summaries. I might do some deeper videos into a couple of the ones I found particularly interesting or the ones that I participated in. But this is just sort of a high-level summary of the ideas that we talked about. So the first thing was the topic of what happens if public trust in institution continues to decline. And so a group of us did a bit of a foresight exercise or a future circle exercise. We kind of mapped out what this could look like. And I thought it was interesting that this idea that trust doesn't necessarily disappear, it just forms in different ways. So if you can't trust major institutions, what can you trust? And so sort of a cloistering into smaller communities, religious groups, family groups, stuff like that became sources of trust. And one of the things that was interesting as we went through the exercise is realizing, yes, there's a lot of negative consequences that could come out of this. But there are some positive things as well, including a stronger sense of community. So another topic that was talked about was this idea of how do we enable cross-sector collaboration more effectively? As the world becomes more and more complex and interconnected, cross-sector collaboration is becoming a more fundamental way of solving these problems. This, of course, is a challenge, though, because different sectors have different ways of thinking and approaching things. And so even just creating a common vocabulary or understanding of a problem or an issue is itself a barrier. They talked a lot about the idea of a permeable membrane to allow for people, ideas, and resources to more effectively move between and across sectors, something that we don't do very well right now, particularly in government. Of course, the challenge is that these things are complex and take time and energy and resources, something that we don't often have. Another topic was this idea of leadership. And what does leadership look like in the modern public service? A recognition that it's changing, and the expectation now is one for much more high level of emotional intelligence, empathy, humility. But what are the conditions that enable this type of leadership to grow? And it's I think, for me, it's a recognition in a world that is much more chaotic and uncertain. Leadership becomes more and more important. And so what type of leadership are we nurturing within our public service? Another topic that came up was this rise of the far right that many countries are running into and the increased political nature of the world. And one of the central pieces this group got into that is something I'm thinking a lot about is how do public servants navigate this increasingly political and polarized world? Is it part of your role as a public servant to fight for what's in the best interest of the community? And if that's the case, does that mean becoming more political, or is it more important now than ever for public servants to maintain that neutrality? And what does that even mean in today's context? And then the final topic for the first section of discussions was really on this idea of sanctuaries for innovators. This recognition that doing innovative work is hard and isolating work, and it's exhausting and emotionally draining, and it's important to have these spaces where you can come and become rejuvenated. Very much like the Creative Bureaucracy Festival itself, oftentimes talked about as like a spa for public servants to recover. And that a sanctuary is about people, but it's also about process, space, time, and trust. And so how do you emphasize this? And the importance of informal communities and networks to help hold this sanctuary space. So in the second round of conversations, another topic that was talked about was community building, something that's near and dear to my heart. So some things this group talked about was that community is not just about doing the work, but also about making the work visible to others in the community. So this quality of sharing best practices. And part of that means capturing what you're doing. So it's not just about the destination, it's about the journey. What was the journey like? Capturing that. And that's really important for allowing others to come and follow behind. The group also talked about this idea of inclusivity. How do we make communities more inclusive while safe at the same time? And this idea of celebration. It's important not just to come together and support each other, but also celebrate wins. And the communities are a great place for that celebration. And that over time of consistent rituals and shared experiences and meaningfully documenting the community, trust is built. over time, and so is resilience. So, communities is not just a flash in the pan thing. It's something that builds and becomes stronger and stronger over time, like a fine wine. Another discussion was on this idea of data, this debate about how can government use data better, and what can we learn from best practice in the private sector, but also what do we need to find public service ways of doing things, because we don't want to just replicate the private sector. The private sector is different than government. That said, there's a lot we can learn from the private sector, in particular on this idea of going faster. Another group had this whole conversation of how can you get ready for a 3-degree warmer world. That's kind of where we're heading, unless things change dramatically. So what does that mean? What does it mean to be resilient in this type of context? And some other ideas that kind of captured within that was the idea of like sovereignty of river and watersheds. Maybe that's where we need to be thinking and organizing our governance structures around. This group also talked about strengthening the bonds between science and the way public service is done, particularly around policy making. And then better connecting governance to place and where people are based. Another discussion was on this idea of how do you defend bureaucracy against populism, and a recognition that right now the public service is losing the debate in the public. Right now the debate and discussion on government is the government is terrible and bad, and there's a lot of negativity around it. And I think this recognition that we need to reclaim, like, look, yes, government needs to be better, but also there's a lot of good things here. You don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And how do we reclaim that narrative around bureaucracy to be one of inclusion, one of hope, one of excitement and promise? After all, the public service is here for the people, and right now they don't feel that way at all. So how do we change the narrative so that people can feel better about it? Basically, the best defense against populism is a bureaucracy that works and that people feel connected to and have a relationship with. And so this is something that we need to really move out of our ivory towers and get right more into the community. And then the final conversation was this idea of X-innovation in complex system. And I think a lot of what this stems from, for me, is this idea of like Jen Paulka's whole point about legacy. And this group really looked at how do we do less? How do we cut things? Doge, but Doge done well. And part of that is really focusing on outputs and then what's needed for those outputs. So stepping back and looking at the big picture of what came out of these different conversations, I think there are a couple patterns. First off, this idea of relationships, community, trust. We seem to be a place right now where trust is low and people are feeling isolated and fractured. And so in some ways, the best response to that is to come together, to turn in towards each other and support each other. And through that, being there for each other, we build trust, we build relationships. So that's sort of one. The second one is this incredible interconnectivity that exists, and then learning how to work with that interconnectivity. Part of it is like translating across different contexts and moving across different contexts and becoming incredibly adaptable and being able to be multilingual, not just in terms of language, but cultural norms of different sectors. We talked, another theme is just that government needs to be braver with what it's doing. I think there's a lot of fear right now in government, and there needs to be this ambition and vision for a better world that we're working towards. We need to get people excited, which means that we need to be excited about where we're going with this. And then finally, there's just this hunger to connect and be connected with each other. So, I mean, the Innovators Forum, as always, was just an absolute blast. I wish it was longer. It's so much is packed into like 2 hours of time, as you can see. Hopefully this gave you a bit of a high-level teaser of what we talked about in the session, and hopefully it inspires your curiosity to dig a bit deeper. I don't know, what do you think? What are the things that you're thinking about? If you were at the Innovators Forum, what topics would you want to see discussed?